Welcome, welcome, welcome back, my Be Health Empowered family, to another week of Excuse Me, Doctor. My name is Dr. Melissa Clark. Please call me Dr. Mel. I am delighted to be back here this week doing what we do every week on Excuse Me, Doctor, which is provide you, the Be Health Empowered family, with the information that you need to make wise health decisions. Of course, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're taking your questions live. So please make sure that you put them in the chat as we go along, anything that you have questions about, or your comments too, because we get to those as well. And if you're a newbie joining us for the first time and you haven't had a chance to hit like on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube, now is an ideal time. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate you. So now let us get into creating an amazing week for ourselves with all the health topics we're going to cover. And I have to bring my partners in crime, so to speak, into the studio to join me. And I'm going to start with the incredible Mr. Wayne Bruce.
All right, Dr. Mel, how you doing?
I am doing all right. How's it going?
Great. I have my matching hat. I'm matching the set
Yes.
today. I'm kind of
Yes, I
excited
see.
about that.
And you kind of have like the fall color thing
The
going, the
fall, it's
mustard
the
and
fall color
the
palette.
orange. Right, right.
It's the
So we're
fall
not
color
there yet
palette.
though. I'm still trying to enjoy those last few days of summer. So
Oh wow, I'm quite sure we will. I'm excited. Since we've started this new guest host thing, we've had a few guest hosts, but
yes.
we've only had one time that we've had one for 3 weeks.
And
And
who is
so
that?
I have to bring on the guest host. It's
All
this for
right.
this week. It's
Drum
Swayze and
roll.
Brian again.
All
Good
right.
evening.
Hi,
Thank you
Sway.
for
How are
having me
you?
back again.
Hey, you're a hit. I mean, and we love having you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. I'm
welcome, welcome.
always excited to be here and to learn from you and all the guests that you bring on the show. So very excited to be here tonight.
All right. And of course, both of y'all are going to be bringing the word from the street, bringing the guests bringing the audience into the studio by
That's it.
giving us the questions and the comments and all that good stuff. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having us, and thank everybody for joining from all over. I see people joining from Florida, New York. I'm
All
excited.
right. Come
Let's
on now.
let's kick it off with the week that was in health and wellness. Huh? How about that with the recap?
All right. Well, we're going to get to the recap, but we have to tease people about what the show is about tonight because it is going to be lit. No pun intended.
I'm ahead of the game, Dr. Mel. The show is about
Oh,
cannabis,
there you go.
and I could be ahead of the game already.
You could be, but we know you're not.
I know.
And we're ahead of the game because we did a show on medical cannabis back in the spring. If you haven't seen it, go on Dr. Melissa Clark on the YouTube channel and just scroll back. You'll see the show that we did on medical cannabis. Today is part 2 of that. Are there negative effects to using cannabis when it comes to the brain? And especially, we care and are concerned about our young people because we know marijuana use is up or cannabis use is up among young people since it's been decriminalized and legalized in many segments of our country, many geographic areas. So we're going to talk about that tonight. It's going to be a really, really good show. We're going to talk about vaping. We're going to talk about addiction. We're going to talk about permanent effects of weed, cannabis on the brain. So please make sure that you share it widely.
Share it. And are
Exactly.
we going to talk about? I mean, always have to ask about the young people and whether the secondhand smoke from kids who may not even
Right.
smoke, it may affect them. So I want to get some answers from my experts on that.
I know I've heard any number of my teacher friends talk about young people coming into the classroom smelling like secondhand smoke from home.
Okay, that's a
Just
polite
saying.
way to say it.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to cover that too.
Well, Dr. Mel, I know Wayne jumped ahead of us and already put the recap on the side. But, I love to come to you for all things COVID. And I'm telling you, it seems like COVID is just about, a thing of the past. So tell us what's going on this week.
Well, it's unfortunately not a thing of the past, but the good news is we are on a downward trend. We've been that way for the last few weeks in terms of hospitalizations, deaths, and even cases, except cases are up in one particular group. Can you guys guess who that is?
I'm not sure.
The elderly.
No,
I don't know.
no clue whatsoever. Kids, actually, since we've been talking about kids, because of back to school, obviously, a lot of jurisdictions have no mask restrictions, no social distancing anymore in schools, and so COVID is kind of running through the childhood population, and we're seeing an increase in cases among kids. So,
Well, Dr. Mel, what's the big COVID vax news? Any updates there?
yeah, there is a new booster that is available that specifically spurs your body to make antibodies against the Omicron variant, as well as the original strain of COVID. So it's called a bivalent vaccine. That means bi means two. It has both those strains within the vaccine. And the previous vaccines were specific only to the original strain of COVID. And we know that that's changed a lot in the last couple of years. And Omicron is now the new dominant variant that's running around. Probably about 95% of cases, or one of the Omicron variants, most likely B5.
Wow.
Yeah, Dr. Mel, I had several friends who have been boosted. They have been vaccinated and boosted and still, ended up catching COVID. So
Right.
is that
What's up with
going to
that?
happen?
Yeah. Well, that is true. With the vaccine previous to this booster, it didn't keep you from getting Omicron because Omicron was able to evade the antibodies that that vaccine helped to produce. What it did do a great job of was keeping people out of the hospital, so not getting really sick and not dying. With this particular booster, it's hoped that there will be fewer cases of Omicron that show symptoms at all, and kind of projecting into the winter, where we've for the last 3 years had surges during the winter and variants pop up during the winter. For that reason, we're hoping that if there's a Omicron related variant that pops up, by having this booster, you're going to be better prepared to face it. So,
Right.
All right. Well, Dr. Mel, I'm getting ready for a couple of vacations coming up. So who's eligible? And if you recently had COVID, can you get this booster?
great questions. So you have to be 12 and over to get the Pfizer booster, 18 and over to get the Moderna booster. If you had COVID already, you should wait 2 to 3 months before getting a booster. Allow the antibodies that form from the infection to do their thing, and also kind of give your immune system a rest. You should have. This is a booster, so this is important. You have to have had your first 2 doses of either Pfizer or Moderna before you get this. And if you had either one of those, you know, the primary series or a booster, previous booster, you should wait 2 months after those doses to get this new booster. So
Sounds
that's who's
good.
eligible.
That's good to know. I mean,
Yep.
look, I want to go straight to number 2. Mind-blowing drugs for mental health. Is that like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds?
Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Y'all know that song? That's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
It's before my time.
Yeah, right. Well, that Beatles song, plus several others 1960 hits, were about psychedelics, which is what we're about to talk about. So things like LSD, psilocybin, they alter how we think, how we feel emotionally, and how we process the world around us through our senses. And they can also cause hallucinations, and they are illicit substances basically, but research is now showing that they might be good for mental health treatments. There have been several recent clinical trials that show that a single treatment with the psychedelic psilocybin, showed sustained decreases in anxiety and depression among patients with a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. It made them less afraid of dying, less afraid of pain, and the treatment journey that they had to go on. There have been also other studies that show in very low doses, so the ones that don't cause hallucinations, that repeated doses of LSD over time are effective in reducing symptoms of stress-related anxiety and depression. So don't run out and get LSD for this reason, because it should be done under the care of a physician. But it could be a breakthrough for the 300 million plus people who suffer from anxiety or depression or both worldwide.
Dr. Mel, don't we have treatment already for depression? I mean, do we have to go out and try to drop a tab of acid to treat
Well,
the depression?
again,
Not
we
that
are
I know
not
anything
recommending
about
that
it.
you do that, right?
Not
We
that
are
I know
not
anything
recommending that
about
you
it.
do that. But we do know that the current treatments for depression, you might have heard of things like Prozac and other classes of antidepressant medications. They only improve symptoms in about 40 to 60% of people. So that's over half, maybe over half, or let's just say half of people with serious depression aren't really getting relief from current treatments. Hence the need to research new ones.
Okay. I just want to say, that talking about mental health brings us to talking about young people, because right now young people are really knocking it out the park and taking care of their mental health. They
Yeah,
like,
I think so. We've seen a jump in mental health treatment during the pandemic from 19% of adults to 22% of adults since the pandemic has been with us. But that's no surprise. But I really wanted to highlight the fact that millennials and Gen Zers have really, I think, made a huge leap in taking the stigma out of seeking help for mental health issues. Part of the increase that I just talked about was due to increased need, obviously, because of the stresses of the pandemic. Um, Mental health care also became more accessible because there's telehealth, there are apps, to help treatment. But people aren't going to take advantage of those if they feel judged, if they're called weird or crazy for doing so. And I think a lot of the um, strides that we've had in terms of taking the stigma out of mental health treatment have been due to young people. So shout out to them.
they just don't care.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Mel, I will tell you, the focus now is like good quality of life, self-care. You know, we have a little saying in my group, protect your peace, and get some help if you need it, and we regularly talk about making our therapy sessions. It's a priority.
All
That
right.
that is fantastic. And shout out to you as a millennial. I'm just saying.
Shout out to you, millennial self.
We now also have the national 988 number. So if you feel overwhelmed, depressed, or struggling with substance use, help is just a phone call away. And I think that is really, really important for everyone to hear.
Yeah, and that 988 number has only been around since July. They've already seen a 45% increase in the number of calls to that line over the old suicide prevention line. So
Wow.
it's making a dent.
It is.
All right, Dr. Mel, this next one is near and dear to my heart as a bison. HU, I know I got some Howard family out in the audience.
But just in
But
case there's some Hampton or Harvard University graduates out there, just to be clear that HU she's talking about is Howard
there's
University.
I'm
always
pretty
Just
sure
one.
saying.
There's
Harvard
always
has never
one.
said
There's always
they're the
one.
real HU.
Well, back to my beloved Howard. It's been 2 years, at the end of last month since we lost Chadwick Boseman due to colon cancer. And, what I am hearing and I feel like is that it's really affecting colon cancer is affecting younger people and also our community, African Americans.
That's true, and they've actually dropped the age for screening for colon cancer from 50 down to 45 because younger people are getting colon cancer. And I really feel like, people were, made aware of the risk of colon cancer because of Chadwick Boseman's death. But since it's been 2 years, that awareness has kind of fizzled away. So I just wanted to highlight that there's some new studies that came out, one of which that reconfirmed that we should be avoiding ultra processed foods because they increase the risk of colon cancer by up to 30%. What are ultra processed foods? Those are the ones that have the additives and the food coloring, just artificial ingredients, things like hot dogs, bacon that has nitrites in it, cheese puffs, what's the flaming hot Cheetos, packaged baked goods, TV dinners. All of those are considered ultra processed foods and more. Those are just examples. So what you want to substitute it with are high fiber foods, foods like apples, greens, oatmeal. If it didn't come directly from a plant or an animal, I say cut way back on it or cut it out altogether.
So Yul Gibbons was was correct about grape nuts.
Yes, they're high fiber.
High fiber. So
although it's probably processed, I would stick with the oats because it came directly from a plant.
Okay, because I just didn't want my mornings to be bland, but I guess it'll keep me here.
Right. Stick with the high fiber foods.
So you do know what time it is, though.
What time is it?
It's time for
the weekly debunk. Stopping misinformation in its tracks.
All right, Dr. Mel, I got a new friend, Tyrese Twitter Fingers.
Okay.
And this week, let me tell you about Tyrese. Tyrese came to me and he said, he was hearing that this new stuff about the COVID vaccine and it killed the animals that they tested it on. And he told me that's why people aren't giving it to their kids, Dr. Mel.
I don't know about that. Excuse me, Dr. Mel, is that true?
Well, no.
Okay.
So where is the truth? There was animal testing of the vaccine. That's true. What's also true is that the vaccine rate for kids under 12 is pretty low. It's down at about 34%. But that's about it. There have been a bunch of false claims going around that the COVID-19 vaccine trials were halted because animals died in the studies that they did prior to testing it on humans. That's not true. It's been posted on social media. There was some Republican senator from Texas who claimed that about a year ago, and it's just recently been put back up on Twitter, has been making the rounds there. There were no animals that died. All animal testing was completed, so there was nothing stopped because animals died. Human vaccine trials then followed that involved over 40,000 people. 10% of those individuals were Black. There was also a larger percentage that were Hispanic. So many people of color participated in the trials. Those trials were completed in 2020. We have had additional ongoing data that's been collected as part of surveillance since people have been receiving the vaccine. And furthermore, the data is constantly being reviewed by the FDA and the CDC. And these are real people that are reviewing this data. For example, Dr. James Hildreth, who's president of Meharry School of Medicine, one of the 4 Black medical schools in the country. He's a specialist in the immune system. He did groundbreaking work to stop the spread of HIV and works with Black churches doing HIV education. He's one of the people, for example, that's reviewed all this data. So we got to get our facts straight. We have to stop repeating stuff from people with a political agenda who are under the impression that COVID, that might be, let me say this, that might be under the impression that COVID only kills people of color. So there's no need to focus on the prevention or spread of COVID-19. So disregard those people that have some kind of other agenda, focus on the facts, and, let's keep protected and get vaccinated.
Let's stay protected. I like that one.
Yep.
All right, Dr. Mel. That's our
All
time.
right. Thank you all for joining us. We are now we're going to see you all later, but we are now going to go straight into what I know a lot of you all have tuned in to hear about. We're talking today about cannabis. We've heard about medical cannabis. Today, we're going to be talking about when people aren't using cannabis appropriately or under supervision. We're drilling down into whether cannabis is safe for young people to use, and especially recreationally, as it's popularly being used, especially now that it's been decriminalized and made legal in many jurisdictions. So we have two incredible guests who are going to walk on this journey with us this evening. The first is Dr. Ruben Baler. He's a health science administrator in the science policy branch in the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, or NIDA, at NIH. His work has been on the regulation of gene expression in the brain's clock. At NIDA, he writes and lectures about the neurobiology of drug abuse and as well as addiction for a range of a range of audiences, from fellow scientists to the lay public. So thank you, Dr. Baler, for joining us tonight.
My pleasure, Mel. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And we also have Miss Nadine Parker. She is the director of the DC Drug Prevention Center in wards 3 and 4, located in Washington, D.C. Those prevention centers are hubs designed to strengthen the community's capacity to prevent and curtail the use of drugs and alcohol through community partnerships and engaging young people and families to promote a healthy life. So thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Parker.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we have a lot to cover. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Baler. Since many states have decriminalized cannabis, what kinds of trends are we seeing in cannabis population and specifically in teens? And actually, either of you could answer that.
Nadine, you want to take this one?
Well, I will start out nationally. Across all states, we're starting to see fentanyl showing up in marijuana that is being tested. Locally here in the district, we see such high strands of hybrid strands that have THC levels that are clearly off of the charts. And then we have edibles. The edibles that you don't know, people do not know how it will affect them until it gets into their system, and they have no idea how much THC is within the edible, as well as the CBD vaping pens, which are becoming extremely popular as well. And we're not just seeing this with adults, we're seeing it with young people. I know a couple of weeks ago you had a show on, and they talked about the opioid and fentanyl and so on and so forth. And most of the time people think of that as, because of an older generation using it. But we're starting to see with that getting into the marijuana, into the edibles, we have a major problem, not just here in the District of Columbia, but nationally. We're seeing all of these different trends, and it's starting younger and younger. Youth in middle school are starting to smoke marijuana, and even with marijuana, with the THC levels at such a high rate, that's a great danger that we're facing.
So we're seeing more concentrated levels of THC We're seeing different forms of ingestion, vaping and eating, and we're seeing fentanyl um, in some of these uh, in some of these products. That's actually the scariest thing to me that
Yeah,
you said,
yeah.
but all of it is definitely concerning. You mentioned vaping. Is vaping in general safer than smoking? Because I get the impression that a lot of young people think that.
Actually, it is not, and I can let Dr. Baylor answer that as well. But I happened to walk into a smoke shop because this is what I do. I do prevention, and the only way I can do prevention is to know exactly what is going on. And I had a look at a CBD vape pen. The THC levels within these pens at, it could be 20, 30, 40, 50. And we all have to know and remember that THC is the responsible component for most um, of the psychological effects as people that I'm sorry, that has a psychological effect on people using it.
Yeah. So, Dr. Baylor, what are the chemical effects of THC on the brain? And maybe you could also break down what's the difference between THC and CBD.
Yeah, well, this is really the key question, and the one that we don't often talk about. When we talk about the brain and marijuana, there is a big black box, like an elephant in the room. Is we don't really know what happens in the brain. What is the target of marijuana? The active ingredient, as Nadine was saying, THC in marijuana. What is THC doing in the brain? And the fact is that there is a very sophisticated, highly evolved system in the brain of all of us that has very specific functions throughout the brain and throughout our lives. This is an endogenous cannabis system that we have. It's called the ECS, for endocannabinoid system. It has its own molecules, its own circuits, its own receptors, and it has a very, very sophisticated function. And the best way that I can think of to explain so people can understand what this ECS, endocannabinoid system, does in the brain, because without understanding that, we can never understand what happens when somebody ingests or smokes marijuana. The ECS really is a system that regulates the brain on demand. And what is an on-demand regulatory system? The best analogy that I could come up with is that everybody knows is the Uber system. Imagine that you're waiting for a ride in the corner of your house, you're waiting for that ride, and on the other side of the city, there is three flights just came to the airport, and there is all of a sudden a flood of 3,000 people waiting for a ride cab home. So there are 3,000 at the airport hailing their Uber system, and there is you in the corner of your house waiting for your ride. So Uber has developed this very specific on-demand app that automatically, instantly regulates the traffic of their Uber drivers. So you have a lot of drivers going to the airport to take care of this this flood of travelers, and then it will send one or two who may be available to your house to pick you up. So this is an on-demand system that really works very well, very sophisticated to regulate in time and space automatically. The ECS, the endocannabinoid system, is very similar. It's a system of molecules in the brain that works on demand. Sometimes a region of the brain needs a lot of activity if you're learning something new. Other regions of the brain may need less activity. So this inhibition and excitation of the activity level in the brain is, for the most part, largely dependent on the ECS, the endocannabinoid system. So understanding the ECS works on demand is a key piece of information to understand what happens when you flood the system with exogenous THC, exogenous Uber drivers that come and flood the entire city with Ubers, all of a sudden in a homogeneous way, without regard for the demand. So you may have 5 Ubers at the airport, picking up those 3,000 travelers, and 5 Ubers next to your house trying to pick you up, and you cannot distinguish which one was yours. So something similar happens with the endocannabinoid system, which is supposed to be working on demand when you flood it with the Uber-like molecules that nobody can distinguish.
So then we have cannabinoids, which is the same sort of chemical that's in THC from cannabis. We have these cannabinoids in our body anyway, and you're saying that, you know, some parts of our brain need less of it at different times and some need more. And so when we flood our system with these cannabinoids that are coming from outside, what happens? What's the downside of that?
Well, you break that regulation. If we go back to the airport example, some people need an Uber to go to work, to pick up their kids, or to do other functions. In the brain, those functions that are critical functions are learning, developing your brain, learning a new tasks, everything that has to do with memory, executive function, making a decision, all those things require on-demand regulation. Sometimes you need a lot of activity, sometimes you need less activity. And you completely perturb that regulation when you flood the ability of that brain to work on demand, when you flood it with these very powerful molecules.
So does that mean then that you might not learn a task as well, or you might not remember what you're supposed to remember? How does that actually play out in our day-to-day lives?
You will be impaired. That function that needs more or less, that is prevented from functioning normally, if you're at school, for example, and you're stoned, your ability to remember those tasks, to remember those lessons, will be impaired. Now, if that happens once, if you are among those travelers that miss the Ubers because there aren't enough, and it happens once, you'll wait and you'll take an Uber next time. You won't change your behavior. But if that keeps happening day after day, every time you reach the airport, you cannot get your Uber, eventually you will change your routine. You will change your behavior. The same thing happens with the brain. It will, by the force of the repetition, it will adapt and change in ways that could be maladaptive. It could make that brain more likely to use other drugs, for example, or unable to remember things long-term on a more persistent way, and lose IQ points, for example, if you use persistently these molecules for a long time.
Wow, that's really important, because what you're saying is that for people that use cannabis over and over and over again on a regular basis, their brain actually rewires, is what I'm hearing you say, and it could be rewired in a way that makes them not remember things, not learn things as well, want to use other drugs or use other drugs to get the same sort of effect, so to speak. Are there any particular concerns when it comes to young people because their brains are developing? Is this seen more in the younger brain?
Absolutely. The brain is a machine that learns for good and for bad. The same way that practice makes perfect when you're practicing a violin, if you repeat a maladaptive behavior for a long time, that practice make perfect will make you perfect in a dark way, will tend to make you more likely to use drugs or to engage in maladaptive behaviors, risky behaviors, or suffer mental illness, or be more vulnerable to mental illness to be manifested. So yeah, you have to think about the brain as a learning machine, and it will learn and adapt to anything that happens to it, whether it's be good stimuli and healthy lifestyle, or on the other hand, unhealthy behaviors. If they are repeated on a regular basis, they will become to have a long-lasting adverse impact.
So you're saying then that some of these effects can be permanent. How might they manifest in an adult who, say, used lots of cannabis when they were younger? What are some of the things that you might observe about yourself if you were one of the people that did that?
One of the most worrisome long-term consequences of chronic cannabis use, particularly when it starts early, is relatively high levels of addiction. You can become addicted to marijuana, particularly if you use heavily, and particularly more so, maybe up to 50% prevalence if you started early. So because the brain learns, the reward circuitry has been changed, has adapted to the constant exposure to THC, which is an addictive substance, just like cocaine, different potencies of addictiveness, but it has the same type of interaction with the reward centers of the brain, that it can teach them, it can lead them to believe that this is what I'm supposed to do. this is where I'm supposed to habituate to. And that's how an addiction begins.
So when you say the reward centers of the brain, you're basically saying that there's a section of our brain that makes us feel satisfied or makes us feel happy or rewarded. And when you use cannabis over and over and over again, it kind of tricks or makes that center rewire to think the only way that I can feel happy or satisfied is if I have this chemical.
Right. Now, it doesn't happen in every person. There is a percentage of individuals who come to the table with a predisposition, with a pre-existing vulnerability. A lot of people use regularly all sorts of drugs and do not become addicted. But there is a portion, particularly higher portion or fraction among adolescents, young people, who will become addicted if they are exposed to these addictive substances.
Makes sense. So, Ms. Parker, are we seeing, or are you seeing, I should say, in your work, more cannabis addiction now among teens? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yes, we are seeing it. I pulled up some data from SAMHSA, and approximately 4.8 million people aged 12 or older in 2019 had marijuana use disorder in the past year. When we started going back into schools and talking with youth and young people after COVID, we were called in. I mean, they wanted folks doing prevention, treatment, looking for recovery, because the youth started using in such high amounts during COVID. Number one, and we would talk to them, and they would say that they used it because they suffered from stress, they suffered from anxiety, they suffered from so many disorders until they used marijuana as a medical device,
as a treatment. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes, they used.
And I would also boredom and isolation too.
Exactly, boarding.
Yeah.
And coming back into the schools, coming back into the normal life, they couldn't function. So we've started looking at different angles, different ways. We now use the term substance use disorder. Okay, many years ago, we used the term substance abuse. No one wants to be identified as a substance abuser. So we use the term substance use disorder, which is a lot more friendlier, and it allows us to go in and to talk to students and to talk to youth, to talk to young people, to talk to families. One of the things that we have found out is that youth smoke marijuana because they think it's okay, and because their parents do it, their peers do it, and their parents do it. We had 2 years where everyone was at home, and you mentioned earlier something about teachers saying that they smelled youth coming into schools smelling like marijuana, because we all know that the marijuana that people are smoking today has a really strong smell that lingers. And so the youth felt that it was okay because their parents were smoking. Okay?
Right.
And
right.
A lot of them developed different behavior issues. They were not able to study in school. They were not able to get to school on time. Okay, so COVID didn't do us any justice in that arena, So, but
in very few arenas, unfortunately, including that.
In very few arenas, but really, our youth suffered tremendously from isolation and the use of marijuana. Not here in the district, but across the nation.
Sure, absolutely. And just for the record, 18 is, the legal age to drink. To vote and join the military. 21 for alcohol. What age does the brain actually finish developing, so you can say you're an adult as far as your brain development is concerned?
But in biology, we don't have step increases. Nothing is dichotomous. Today is yes, tomorrow is not. Tomorrow today you are immature and tomorrow you are mature. There's always a gradient, a curve. So I think that most of the development is pretty much done by the time that you are 22, 23 years of age. But there is always adaptation, there is always plasticity in the brain, which is what makes living exciting. You can learn and change and adapt at any age, pretty much. But most of the maturation at the different levels, there are different processes of brain development. Most of it, I would say 80 to 90%, happens between, let's say, 5 and 19, 20 years of age. But there continues to be development. So that's the window of vulnerability where the addictive drugs has the most potential to cause long-term harm.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And then just wanted to really quickly get in this. How about secondhand smoke in the home, secondhand cannabis smoke? Can it affect children, not just from the inhalation of smoke particles, but the actual chemical, the THC itself?
Absolutely. There are studies in animals and in humans. This secondhand exposure is a very real thing. Of course, again, we have the gradient. It's not the same thing to be exposed to the full harm or exposure of a cigarette if you puff from it, or the somewhat diluted smoke that may be lingering in a room. But that's a constant. If it's in an enclosed environment, there could be dilute smoke, but for a long time. So that could definitely affect. There are studies in insects that show epigenetic changes due to secondhand smoke that can change the way genes express. And not only that, but there is also a phenomenon called third-hand smoking, which is all those particles when they get stuck in the carpet, in upholstery, and they linger for much longer times. And if you have toddlers crawling over surfaces, and those surfaces, if you go with a microscope or with a SPECT machine, you will identify some of those toxic compounds that the kids will touch and will put in their mouth, and they could have third-hand experiences as well.
Wow, that's super concerning. You know what? We have to get to the audience questions because I'm sure there's at least one or two in the chat. So Wayne and Sway, what are you seeing out there?
All right. So we have a lot of questions. And so I want to start one of our audience members, Tracy Walls. She has the question: what is the difference between cannabis and marijuana, and is there a difference?
Well, we actually answered that in marijuana in Cannabis Part 1. So I would encourage Tracy to go back and listen to that. But do either of you want to take that?
Well, cannabis is just the name of the professional, the type of a jargon that we use for several strains of cannabis. Some of them have more THC, which is the active ingredient. Some of them have less THC. Hemp is a cannabis plant, for example, but doesn't have THC. Marijuana is the popular name that everybody uses without distinction. But the different strains of cannabis, which is the Latin name for the plant, have different levels, ratios between the different cannabinoids, THC, CBD, and so forth.
Thank you so much. Cannabis is actually sort of the accurate plant name. Another physician who was on in the first episode mentioned that marijuana was sort of the name given to it at the time that it became illegal to use as a way to sort of stigmatize its use and associate it with Mexico and foreigners, quote unquote. So interesting background. Next question. What else you got?
Got a question coming from, and Yvonne always has great, our viewer, listener, Yvonne Smith always has great questions. And she asked, one of her questions are, what are the signs your child might be using marijuana?
Excellent. Ms. Parker, would you like to take that?
Certainly. Well, there's several signs. One is anxious, being anxious, the inability to sleep, the inability to just relate and do the same things that they used to do, to play with other people, especially if their friends have changed. If they're unable to complete their assignments, if they're you know, of course, it's still the old tell signs of, you know, the red eyes, you know, the overeating, you know, but mainly the anxiousness, depression, and anxiety, irritability, and not sleeping. Those are some of the first strong signs that suggest that there is a problem.
If I may add, it's very important to supervise very closely academic performance. If there is any change in academic performance, grades, or lack of interest, that is probably one of the first things to pop up as a red flag that the parent typically should be on top of and should be easy to identify.
Okay.
Nobody mentioned lip color.
That's a very good one. Yes. The darkening of the lips. Yes.
I just had that conversation with the young person today about the lip color.
Yeah.
Wow, your lips dark.
Mm-hmm.
You might have to turn up your volume, Wayne.
Okay, I gotta get closer.
Oh, yeah,
All
there
right.
we go.
There we go.
All right.
Uh,
What else do you
and-
have?
So I have a question and I can't remember who may have asked this question, but it is, you know, whether you're using medically or recreationally, at what point is it safe to drive after using marijuana?
Dr. Baylor?
Well, it's never safe to drive after you use marijuana. I would wait as much as possible, maybe even 2 days. Marijuana, depending on how much you smoke or how much you use, is a highly lipophilic molecule. It likes to stay in fat tissues for a long time, from which it will keep leaching for a while. That's why it's so difficult to detect to be detected by policemen, like alcohol, for example, because you can detect it in the system for a long time, but that won't tell you when you actually used the last time. So it can linger in the system for a long time, and it can have, depending on the person, if it's a very sensitive person to the effects of THC, it could still be affecting your cognition long after you stop the smoking, for example. So I cannot give you a precise number because there are so many variables that will be different between different individuals. It will be responsible of me to give you a number of hours after which you can drive safely.
But Dr. Mel, some states are looking at legislation to enact a DUI on persons that are caught from being high from marijuana and driving. And some states actually are already processing DUIs for being intoxicated, being high from marijuana.
Wow, thanks for adding that in. Yeah, definitely.
We have
Good to know.
another question from Vanessa Parker. Is there a big difference between medical cannabis versus the states that it is recreational, legal, on how they test the products? The difference between medical cannabis and the recreational cannabis, where states that are legal.
What I can say in general is that we should recognize what the medicinal marijuana effort was all about, which was really a stepping stone from the lobby, the cannabis lobby, to eventually legalize recreational use. Marijuana does have a couple of legitimate medicinal uses, not marijuana, but the active ingredient, which is THC, and now CBD. We have very limited examples, very few examples of legitimate use of cannabinoids, THC or CBD, for medicinal purposes. Nothing yet for marijuana, which is a very complex extracted material from plants, which has hundreds of different compounds, which are very challenging to study. This is why it's so difficult to validate any particular indication for marijuana as a plant. We don't have any other example of a medicine that comes from a plant, that you just take a pestle and a mortar and make a medicine, FDA-approved medicine out of a plant, a complex plant. So I think that's important to make the distinction before we go into those kinds of specific questions about differences in the state. It's important to lay down this fact that the medicinal marijuana today is still not an FDA-approved compound.
That's it.
Okay. But it's medical cannabis can be legally prescribed in some places for, as Dr. Baler mentioned, a narrow indication of reasons.
But this is
But
just a
there's not a
reflection.
lot of regulation. There's not a lot of regulation around it to say, you know, I'm writing you a prescription for X number of milligrams of this. So that's one of the reasons, again, why there's not necessarily a standardization, if that's what the question was about. There's not necessarily a standardization in terms of what's actually contained in some of the prescriptions.
It's worse than that. There is no research to validate the use of medicinal marijuana for any indication. There is no research, or very little research, specifically for different populations. Research that really takes into account differences in age, differences in gender, underlying vulnerabilities, mental illness. So the research in medical marijuana is really very sparse and not that rigorous. And this is why we don't have any FDA-approved medical marijuana preparation. We have FDA-approved cannabinoids preparations, that is THC, based on THC, and now based on CBD for a very limited number of indications, but not medical marijuana per se.
Right. Yeah, I was speaking to the.
One.
Yeah, I was speaking to the. I was trying to get at her question about the standardization, as I interpreted it anyway. But
yeah.
Yes. So go ahead. What's the next question?
We have a question from. Are you saying one of the questions? Will the brain die or be fried with kids are using marijuana? And are you saying that youth learning will be permanently impaired?
Yeah, what I'm saying is not that the brain will die or fry, is that you are shortchanging yourself. You will not reach your 100% potential. You might reach 99.9, 80, 60, or 20, depending on who you are and what other drugs you use, at what age you started. But you are shortchanging yourself. You're not going to reach your 100% potential as if you had never used a psychoactive drug like marijuana.
Okay. I think that pretty starkly explains what you were saying. Yeah, very succinctly explains it.
And we have another question, and more of a statement. Cannabis lowers inhibitions, which causes lessening of impulse control. Can you speak to that?
Well, that's an effect that cannabis has similar to alcohol. It will cause some level of disinhibition, behavioral disinhibition. So you feel freer to engage in activities that may be considered risk-taking activities that you would otherwise not engage in, like unprotected sex, for example. There are some aspects of cannabis use that are reminiscent of the effects that one sees with alcohol.
Do you see more
Ms. Parker?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask Ms. Parker if she, in your work, are you seeing the secondary effects of risk-taking behavior as well for people who have chronic marijuana use, similar to what Dr. Baler mentioned?
Yes, yes, we do see youth, including adults, that are not, as Dr. Baler said, reaching their potential because of the use, because of substance use disorder. You know, once again, it could be it could be alcohol, it could be marijuana, it can be opioids, and that goes back to the driving. Why people should not drive immediately after smoking marijuana. It's just like drinking. Your receptors are everything is slowed down.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Wayne. Go ahead with the next question.
Are you seeing an increased use of different strains of marijuana in the community, unlike previous strains you've seen before?
I think that's for you, Ms. Parker.
Yes, there are. When we talk about strains of marijuana, we also have to keep in mind that there's also a synthetic form of we don't even call it synthetic marijuana, but there is a synthetic form. There are people are really getting into, once again, the THC levels. They're getting into the type of marijuana that is being used. Those marijuanas that have been laced with fentanyl, with all all other kinds of drugs and components that would make it a lot stronger. And you can really tell just by the smell of, you can be in your car driving, and a car can drive past, and that smell can get into your car, and that tells you right there that marijuana has been treated with something differently than just marijuana from a natural plant.
Wow. So it sounds like the answer is yes, yes, and yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Do we have time to sneak in one more? Okay.
One last question. And it comes from Yvonne again. She's so on top of things. What do parents do, or what should you do if you find a young person who is using the substance?
You want to start, NIDA?
Yes. The first thing, I think you should really talk with them and identify, first of all, their source. Identify what drug they are doing, and immediately try to get them help. Try to talk to a counselor. You all were talking earlier about counselors. Counseling in this day and age is very, very important. It's not necessarily treatment, but it's addressing the underlying problem. And in today's society, we have co-occurring disorder, which is mental health disorder along with substance use disorder. And when you start mixing those two together, then that's when you have a major problem that needs to be addressed. But don't be afraid to ask your child what they are using. And also, one thing we haven't hit upon when we talked about secondhand smoke, we have to think about one of the biggest things that is in our community right now happens to be edibles. And when we talk about children having access to edibles, because edibles look like the gummies that children eat, the brownies, the cookies, and we don't really address that into the fact that edibles can really be extremely harmful because they get to your system at a different rate, and they can be just as or more effective on your mental health as smoking marijuana.
Right. Did you want to add to that, Dr. Baler?
No, I totally agree that the first step is really to understand why are the kids using, whether it's peer pressure, they are affiliated with deviancy or risk taking, or where there is, as Nadine was saying, an underlying mental situation there. But the second aspect that I would really like to emphasize is that the education is really empowering, and I would urge everybody to learn about their brains, like the ECS that we were talking at the beginning. The endocannabinoid system is very important to know what goes on inside the brain. That is empowering information and cool information.
Yes. On that note, I just want to thank both of you for joining us. Ms. Nadine Parker, Dr. Ruben Baler, thank you so much. Thank you, of course, to my fantastic co-host, Swayzine Bryant, for joining us again. And of course, Wayne Bruce. And of course, the Be Health Empowered audience. You guys show up every week with fantastic questions. I just want to round out by reminding everybody in the Be Health Empowered family that there's that special research study at Howard University. It's still going on. They've asked me to invite anybody who listens to the show to participate in the COVID resilience research study. It's voluntary. It involves filling out a 2-part survey, and you will be compensated up to $100 for completing those surveys. If you have any interest, remember, contact Dana Harvey at danaharveyresearch@gmail.com. That's DANAHARVEY research@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you back next week. And remember to be well, to be wise, and to be health empowered. Thanks for joining.
Hey, right? They still don't know. I hooked up with Dave 3 days ago. He'll start coughing tomorrow. And I bet in 10 days he'll be on a ventilator. Now, his wife, she's not vaccinated because she thinks it'll prevent her from being pregnant. But what they don't know is that I can decrease sperm count. Sorry, Dave. Good luck with that.